The clinking of crystal champagne flutes abruptly ceased, replaced by a suffocating, collective gasp that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the grand ballroom. At the podium, bathed in the harsh glare of the spotlight, David adjusted his bespoke tuxedo, his arm wrapped tightly around a woman who was decidedly not his wife of 12 years. He smiled into the microphone, a blinding, arrogant flash of teeth, and announced that true success required true passion, and he had finally found his with his new vice president of communications. In the center of the room, his wife, Caroline, didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply checked her watch, knowing that in exactly 4 minutes, the empire David thought he ruled would be reduced to absolute ashes. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in New York City was dripping in opulence, a fitting venue for the 10-year anniversary gala of Omnicorp Logistics. The room was a sea of black-tie elite, Wall Street heavyweights, and Silicon Valley disruptors. At the center of it all was David Kensington, charismatic, fiercely handsome, and hailed by Forbes as the supply chain visionary of the decade. He worked the room with the practiced ease of a politician, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, and exuding an aura of invincibility. Watching him from a velvet-lined alcove was Caroline. To the outside world, Caroline Kensington was the perfect, supportive corporate spouse. She organized the charity drives, hosted the Hamptons retreats, and smiled gracefully in the background of David's magazine covers. But behind closed doors, beneath the glossy veneer of their Manhattan penthouse, Caroline was the invisible engine of Omnicorp. When they were 24, working out of a damp, radiator-clanking apartment in Chicago, it was Caroline who wrote the proprietary routing algorithm that made Omnicorp faster and cheaper than any competitor. It was Caroline who stayed up until 4 a.m. drafting the initial venture capital pitches. And it was Caroline who, out of blind love and a desire to see her husband shine, agreed to let David take the title of CEO and the lion's share of the public credit. "Let me be the face, Care," he had told her years ago, kissing her forehead over a stack of legal documents. "Investors respond to my pitch. You hate the spotlight anyway, but this is ours. 50-50. Always." It hadn't been 50-50 in a very long time. The first cracks in the foundation hadn't been explosive. They were insidious, quiet things. The sudden late-night strategy meetings, the unexplained charges on the corporate Amex, and then the perfume, a cloying, overly sweet scent of jasmine and vanilla that lingered on David's collar when he crept into bed at 3 a.m. That scent belonged to Chloe Hastings. Chloe was 26, ruthlessly ambitious, and the recently hired director of public relations. She had a penchant for designer heels she couldn't afford on her salary, and a habit of touching David's arm a little too softly, a little too long, during board meetings. Caroline wasn't naive. When the whispers started circulating through the corporate grapevine, she didn't throw a plate or demand a tearful confrontation. She was an engineer by trade. She relied on data. 3 months ago, Caroline had hired a private investigator, a discreet former MI6 operative named Simon. The dossier Simon handed her in a dimly lit coffee shop a week later was thick enough to serve as a doorstop. It contained time-stamped photos of David and Chloe entering a boutique hotel in Tribeca, transcripts of text messages that turned Caroline's stomach, and, most damning of all, financial records. David wasn't just sleeping with Chloe. He was funding her lifestyle using Omnicorp's mezzanine capital. He had bought her a $2 million loft in Soho through a dummy corporation, classifying it as executive housing. He was funneling money out of the very company Caroline had built, risking SEC violations and federal fraud charges, all to impress a woman a decade his junior. The betrayal was a physical blow, a sharp, twisting knife in her ribs. But after the tears dried, A terrifying glacial calm washed over Caroline. She didn't want a messy, crying divorce. She didn't want half of what he had. She wanted everything. She wanted the empire back. For the past 90 days, Caroline had worked in absolute secrecy with her fiercely brilliant corporate attorney, Sarah Jenkins, and Omnicorp's disgruntled chief financial officer, Thomas Sterling. Thomas had noticed the financial irregularities weeks before and was terrified of going down with the ship. Together, the three of them had woven a legal net so tight, so impeccably disguised in corporate bureaucracy, that David, who never read the fine print of the contracts Caroline handed him to sign, had no idea the ground beneath him had already been hollowed out. As Caroline stood in the ballroom, taking a slow sip of her gin and tonic, she caught David's eye across the room. He smiled his golden smile and raised his glass to her. She raised hers back, her expression unreadable. She wore a stunning, emerald green Oscar de la Renta gown, a colour David always said made her look regal. Tonight, it felt like armour. Beside David, Chloe appeared, wearing a daring crimson silk dress that clung to her every curve. She leaned in to whisper something in David's ear, and he threw his head back in a booming laugh. "They look awfully comfortable," a voice murmured beside Caroline. It was Thomas, the CFO, holding a club soda, his knuckles white. "Are we still go for tonight?" "We are, Thomas," Caroline replied softly, her eyes fixed on her husband and his mistress. "Everything is in place. Is the server migration complete?" "Finished an hour ago," Thomas confirmed, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Meridian Trust now officially holds the exclusive rights to the routing algorithm. Omnicorp's license expires at midnight unless renewed by the patent holder, which is you. And the banks? Notified of the impending breach of morality clauses and financial irregularities, they have their finger on the button to pull the credit lines. Caroline, if he does what we think he's going to do tonight, there's no coming back from this. The stock is going to crater in tomorrow's pre-market. "I built it, Thomas," Caroline said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I can rebuild it. But first, the rot has to be burned out." A soft chime echoed through the room as David stepped up to the grand podium at the front of the ballroom, tapping the microphone. The chatter died down. The moment had arrived. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, friends," David began, his voice a rich baritone that effortlessly commanded the massive room. The spotlights converged on him, casting a halo effect that he practically leaned into. 10 years, a decade ago, Omnicorp was nothing but a whiteboard and a dream. Tonight we stand as a billion-dollar titan in global logistics. Polite, enthusiastic applause rippled through the crowd. Caroline stood perfectly still, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. "They say building a company like this requires blood, sweat, and tears," David continued, pacing the stage slightly, masterfully working his angles for the press cameras stationed at the back. And they are right. It requires a relentless pursuit of perfection. It requires late nights, missed holidays, and a singular, uncompromising vision. He paused, letting the silence hang. He was a master of the dramatic pause. "But more than that," David's voice softened, taking on an intimate, almost confessional tone. "It requires muse. It requires someone standing beside you who truly understands your vision. Someone who doesn't just support your ambition, but matches it. Someone whose fire fuels your own." The crowd smiled. Heads turned naturally toward Caroline. This was the part of the speech where the CEO thanked his long-suffering wife. People raised their glasses in her direction, offering polite nods. Caroline didn't break her gaze from David. She saw the slight tightening of his jaw, the arrogant spark in his eyes. "For years," David said, his tone shifting, becoming a fraction colder, "I thought I had to separate my personal life from my professional one. I thought passion belonged in the boardroom, and duty belonged at home. But true innovators know that division is a lie. True greatness comes when your life and your work are perfectly aligned, when the person beside you isn't just a partner in name, but a partner in spirit. The smiles in the crowd began to falter slightly. The phrasing was odd. It lacked the usual rehearsed warmth. Recently, Omnicorp has undergone a massive internal evolution, David said, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on the crimson dress. And so have I. I realized that to take this company into its next decade, I need absolute honesty. I need to walk in my truth. He extended a hand toward the front row. Chloe, please. Come up here. The ballroom went dead silent, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. Chloe, feigning a look of coy surprise, stepped forward. The crimson silk shifted as she glided up the steps to the stage, taking David's outstretched hand. He pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her waist. Many of you know Chloe Hastings as our brilliant director of PR, David announced, his voice booming through the speakers, defiant and proud. But to me, she is so much more. She is the future. She is the fire I was talking about. Effective immediately, Chloe will be stepping up as the new executive vice president of Omnicorp. He paused, looking out over the sea of shocked faces. He locked eyes with Carolyn. There was no apology in his gaze, only the brutal, callous triumph of a man who believed he held all the cards. Furthermore, David continued, the words dropping like anvils onto the silent room, I am announcing tonight that Caroline and I are separating. It is an amicable decision, recognizing that we have grown in different directions. Chloe and I are building a new life together, and a new era for Omnicorp. To the future. He raised his glass. No one else did. The silence was so profound that the drop of a pin would have sounded like a gunshot. A few uncomfortable flashes went off from the press cameras, capturing the sheer, unabashed audacity of the moment. A CEO, at his company's 10-year gala, publicly discarding his wife of 12 years to promote and parade his 26-year-old mistress. It was corporate suicide mixed with a public execution. Whispers erupted instantly. A frantic, hissing buzz swept through the elite crowd. Board members exchanged wide-eyed, terrified glances. Investors pulled out their phones, furiously texting their brokers. On stage, David's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, as the expected applause failed to materialize. Chloe looked out at the hostile, glaring faces of Manhattan's elite, her confident smirk beginning to tremble. In the center of the storm, Caroline stood immaculate. She didn't flush red. She didn't drop her glass. She slowly, deliberately, set her crystal tumbler down on a passing waiter's tray. She smoothed the skirt of her emerald gown. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea as she stepped forward. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, expecting a scream, a slap, a tearful breakdown. Caroline walked until she was at the edge of the stage, looking up at David and Chloe. David puffed out his chest, preparing for a confrontation, opening his mouth to speak. Caroline simply raised a single, perfectly manicured finger to her lips in a shh gesture. She then looked at her Rolex. It was 9:41 p.m. She gave David a smile that was so utterly devoid of warmth it could have frozen nitrogen, turned on her heel, and walked out of the ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind her, echoing like a judge's gavel. The atmosphere inside the ballroom was radioactive. The gala had instantly transformed into a morbid wake. People were speaking in hushed, frantic tones, shooting dirty looks at the stage. David, trying to salvage the moment, ushered a pale-looking Chloe off the stage and toward the private VIP antechamber behind the ballroom. "That went well, I think," David muttered, loosening his tie as the heavy door sealed them in the soundproofed room. He poured himself a massive scotch. Shocking at first, sure, but the market loves a bold, decisive leader. It establishes dominance. Chloe slumped onto a leather sofa, looking thoroughly rattled. "David, no one clapped. Did you see Arthur Sterling's face? He looked like he wanted to murder you." "Sterling is a dinosaur," David scoffed, taking a long drink. "He's old money. He doesn't understand modern corporate dynamics. By Monday, the news cycle will have moved on to our new AI initiative, and Caroline will be a distant memory. I'm having the lawyer send her the standard severance and NDA package tomorrow." "Are you sure she'll sign it?" Chloe asked, biting her lip. She looked terrifying. "Caroline?" David laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Caroline is a mouse, a very smart mouse who writes good code, but a mouse nonetheless. She doesn't have the stomach for a fight. She'll take the 20 million, quietly buy a house in Connecticut, and disappear." At exactly 9:45 p.m., David's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was an automated text from the company's internal server monitoring system. "Critical alert. Omnicorp mainframe root access denied. License expired. Error code 404. David frowned, tapping the screen. "That's weird. System glitch." A second later, Chloe's phone buzzed. Then David's buzzed again, and again. Suddenly, both of their phones were vibrating violently, an endless cascade of notifications, emails, and text messages. Before David could unlock his screen, the door to the VIP room burst open. It was Thomas, the CFO. He wasn't pale. He was a sickly, translucent shade of grey. His bow tie was undone, and he was clutching an iPad like it was a live grenade. "David!" Thomas gasped, out of breath. "What did you do? What the hell did you just do?" "Watch your tone, Thomas," David snapped, irritated. "It was a PR move. It's handled. Why is the routing server throwing error codes?" "Because we don't own the routing server," Thomas yelled, his voice cracking. "We don't own the algorithm. We don't own the patents." David froze, his scotch glass halfway to his mouth. "What are you talking about? Of course we do. We patented it 8 years ago." "No, David," Thomas said, jabbing a finger at the iPad. "You didn't patent it. Meridian Holdings patented it. And Omnicorp has been licensing it from Meridian for the past 8 years. Meridian Holdings is a shell company we set up for tax purposes," David barked. "I own Meridian." "You own 49% of Meridian," Thomas corrected him, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Caroline owns 51. She has voting control. And the licensing agreement had a morality clause and a key man provision tied to your marriage. By publicly severing your partnership and declaring a hostile separation, you just triggered a breach of contract." David felt the blood drain from his face. "Fix it. Call IT. Override the system. There is no system to override. She migrated the source code off our physical servers at 8 p.m. tonight. Our logistics network is dead, David. FedEx, Amazon, Maersk, all of our clients' freight routes just went dark. We are currently navigating blind. We are racking up millions of dollars in SLA breach penalties by the minute." Chloe stood up, her voice shrill. "Well, call Caroline. Tell her to turn it back on." Thomas ignored her, staring a hole through David. "It gets worse. The banks." "What about the banks?" David whispered, his arrogant bravado evaporating, replaced by a cold, creeping terror. "You used company funds to buy the Soho loft," Thomas said, his eyes darting to Chloe. "You classified it as executive housing, but you put the deed in her name." "That's embezzlement, David. Caroline's lawyer filed a report with the SEC and the DOJ an hour ago, and she CC'd our primary lenders at Chase and Goldman Sachs." David stumbled backward, his legs suddenly failing him. He collapsed into a leather armchair. She wouldn't. She'd destroy her own equity. She'd destroy the company. "She didn't destroy it," Thomas said softly. "She just reclaimed her assets. Omnicorp is a shell without her algorithm. The banks just issued margin calls on our revolving credit lines. They're demanding $300 million by Monday morning, or they force us into Chapter 11 bankruptcy." David stared blankly at the wall. The Scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. The amber liquid seeped into the expensive rug. "Where is she?" David croaked, his voice barely audible. "Gone," Thomas said. "She left the hotel." "Get her on the phone," David demanded, suddenly frantic, leaping up from the chair. "Get her on the phone right now. I'll give her whatever she wants. I'll apologize. I'll fire Chloe." "David!" Chloe shrieked, looking at him in sheer betrayal. "Shut up, Chloe," David roared, completely losing his composure. He looked at Thomas with wild, desperate eyes. "Dial her." Thomas sighed heavily, pulling out his own phone. "She left a message for you with me. She said to tell you." Thomas paused, looking down at his screen. She said, "Tell David he can keep the microphone. I'm taking the company." The grand wooden door opened again. This time, it was two men in dark suits, flashing badges. Behind them, the ballroom was in absolute chaos, a cacophony of shouting voices and ringing phones as the news hit the wire. Omnicorp's private stock value was plummeting in real time, evaporating faster than ice on a griddle. "David Kensington?" the lead agent asked, his voice flat and authoritative. "We're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working in conjunction with the SEC. We need you to step this way, sir. We have a warrant regarding wire fraud and the misappropriation of corporate funds." David looked at the agents, then at Thomas, then at the shattered glass on the floor. In less than 10 minutes, his public triumph had metamorphosed into a total, devastating annihilation. He had walked onto that stage, an undisputed king. He was leaving it in handcuffs, utterly destroyed by the silent architect he had so foolishly thought he could discard. As the agents placed their hands on David's shoulders, Chloe backed away, pressing herself against the wall, realizing that the golden goose she had manipulated wasn't just dead. It was a ticking bomb, and she was standing right in the blast radius. The weekend passed, not in days, but in a blur of frantic conference calls, emergency injunctions, and a media frenzy that bordered on apocalyptic. By 8 a.m. on Monday, Omnicorp Logistics was bleeding out on the operating table. The company's proprietary algorithm, the digital brain that routed thousands of shipping containers, freight trains, and delivery trucks globally, remained dark. Without it, the company was forced into manual routing, a process so antiquated it was like asking a modern airline to navigate by the stars. Global supply chains stuttered. Major retailers threatened breach of contract lawsuits. Omnicorp's valuation, which had been resting at a comfortable $1.2 billion on Friday afternoon, was in freefall on the secondary markets. In a sterile, glass-walled conference room 40 stories above Wall Street, Caroline Kensington sat at the head of a massive oak table. She was flanked by her attorney, Sarah Jenkins, a woman whose terrifying reputation in corporate litigation was matched only by her immaculate, tailored suits. Across the table sat the Omnicorp board of directors. They looked like they had collectively aged 10 years over the weekend. At the center of the board's panic was Harrison Cole, a ruthless venture capitalist who held a significant equity stake. His face was a mask of barely contained fury. "Turn the servers back on, Carolyn," Harrison demanded, slamming a palm on the table. "You're holding your own company hostage. We are hemorrhaging clients by the hour. Amazon is threatening to pull their entire East Coast contract by noon if we don't restore automated routing." Caroline didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her black coffee. "I am not holding anything hostage, Harrison. Meridian Holdings owns the software. Omnicorp's license was revoked due to a blatant violation of the morality and keyman clauses signed by your former CEO. It's simply business." "David was an idiot," Harrison snarled, his voice rising. "A spectacular, arrogant idiot. But you are destroying our capital to settle a domestic dispute. I will have our lawyers file an emergency injunction to seize the algorithm under the doctrine of corporate necessity." Sarah Jenkins smiled, a thin, razor-sharp expression that made Harrison physically recoil. "You can certainly try, Mr. Cole. But as you know, the IP is domiciled in a holding company operating out of Delaware with a subsidiary trust in the Cayman Islands. By the time your injunction makes it through the appellate courts, Omnicorp will be in Chapter 7 liquidation. You have $300 million in debt obligations due by Wednesday. You have no cash flow, no software, and a CEO currently sitting in a federal holding cell." The room fell deathly silent. The board members exchanged terrified, defeated glances. They were trapped, and they knew it. "What are your terms?" An older board member, William, asked quietly, his voice defeated. Caroline folded her hands on the table. This was the moment she had engineered. "My terms are non-negotiable. First, David is removed as CEO, stripped of his severance package, and his equity is forfeited to the company to cover the massive legal liabilities he has triggered with his embezzlement. Second, I am appointed sole CEO and chairman of the board. Third, I require a restructured equity split. Meridian Holdings will absorb Omnicorp. I walk away with 80% ownership. The remaining 20% will be divided among the existing shareholders." 80%? Harrison gasped, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "That's highway robbery. You're wiping out our investments." "I am saving what's left of them," Caroline corrected him, her voice dropping to a low, icy register. "If I walk out that door, Omnicorp defaults on its loans by tomorrow morning. Your shares become absolutely worthless, and you will spend the next 5 years fending off class action lawsuits from angry investors. Give me the 80%, and I flip the switch on the servers. The routing algorithm goes live in 10 seconds, and I personally guarantee I can salvage the Amazon contract by noon." She slid a thick stack of legal documents across the table. "You have exactly 5 minutes to sign, or I go start a new logistics firm across the street, and I take every single one of your clients with me." While Carolyn was executing her bloodless coup in the boardroom, David Kensington was experiencing a very different kind of Monday morning. He was sitting in a cinder-block interrogation room in the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. He was still wearing the bespoke tuxedo from Saturday night, though it was now deeply wrinkled, smelling of stale sweat and despair. His high-priced defense attorney, Gregory Hayes, paced the small room, looking uncharacteristically grim. "They're not offering bail, David," Gregory said, rubbing his temples. "The U.S. attorney is arguing you're a flight risk. They found the offshore accounts." David's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes wide with panic. "What offshore accounts? I didn't—" "Don't lie to me," Gregory snapped. "The SEC traced $4 million routed through Omnicorp's vendor payment system into a shell company in Belize, a shell company that is linked directly to your mistress, Chloe Hastings. You didn't just buy her a loft, David. You were siphoning venture capital funds to build a golden parachute." I was going to put it back," David stammered, his arrogant facade completely shattered. "It was just a temporary bridge loan for investments." "You embezzled corporate funds," Gregory corrected him harshly. "And because you did it over state and international lines, it's federal wire fraud. To make matters worse, your wife's legal team filed an emergency freeze on all your personal assets on Sunday morning. Your bank accounts, your brokerage portfolios, the penthouse, it's all locked up in a constructive trust pending the divorce and the federal investigation." "So unfreeze it!" David yelled, slamming his fists on the metal table. "I need money for bail. I need to pay you." "That's the other thing," Gregory said, stopping his pacing and looking at David with cold professional detachment. "Without access to your funds, I require a $500,000 retainer secured by a liquid asset. Since you don't have that, I can only represent you through the arraignment this afternoon. After that, You'll need to secure public counsel." David stared at his lawyer, the reality of his situation finally crashing over him like an ocean wave. The empire was gone. The money was gone. His freedom was hanging by a thread. "Get Chloe," David whispered desperately. "She has access to the Belize account. Tell her to wire the retainer. Tell her I need her." Gregory let out a slow, cynical sigh. "I wouldn't count on Ms. Hastings, David. The FBI raided her Soho loft at 6 a.m. this morning." The loft in Soho was exactly what one would expect a 26-year-old, newly minted executive to buy with stolen money. It featured exposed brick, floor-to-ceiling windows, imported Italian marble countertops, and currently 4 federal agents tearing through it with methodical precision. Chloe Hastings sat on her $15,000 white velvet sofa, wearing silk pajamas, shivering uncontrollably despite the warm morning sun streaming through the windows. Her phone lay on the coffee table, dead. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. An FBI agent approached her, holding a stack of file folders they had pulled from her home office safe. "Ms. Hastings, we're going to need you to come downtown with us. We have a few questions regarding your role as a signatory on the Belize accounts." "I didn't do anything!" Chloe shrieked, her carefully cultivated PR poise evaporating into raw panic. "David set all of that up. He told me it was a standard executive compensation package. I don't even know how to route international wire transfers." "Then you'll have plenty of time to explain that to the prosecutors," the agent said, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "But given that your name is on the deed to this property and your signature is on the transfer authorizations, you're currently an accessory to a multi-million-dollar federal fraud." Within 2 hours, Chloe was sitting in a different interrogation room, just 2 floors down from David. Her situation, however, was entirely different. She didn't have a high-priced lawyer pacing the room. She had a harried, overworked public defender who looked like he hadn't slept since Thursday. The door opened, and a federal prosecutor walked in, dropping a massive binder on the table. "Here is the reality of your situation, Ms. Hastings," the prosecutor began, not even bothering to sit down. "We have the bank records. We have the internal Omnicorp emails where you requested expedited vendor payments to the dummy corporation. We are looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison for conspiracy and wire fraud." Chloe burst into tears, her face burying into her hands. "I didn't know. He lied to me. He said his wife was crazy, that she was trying to steal his company. He said he just needed a safe place to park the money until the divorce was finalized." The prosecutor exchanged a look with the public defender. Ignorance is not a defense when you're living in a stolen $2 million apartment. However, the prosecutor leaned over the table, his eyes locking onto Chloe's terrified face. "The Department of Justice is primarily interested in David Kensington. We want the CEO. If you can provide documented proof that David orchestrated the embezzlement, and if you are willing to testify against him in open court, we might be willing to discuss full immunity and a plea down to a misdemeanor." Chloe stopped crying. The survival instinct of a cornered animal kicked in, cold and absolute. David had promised her the world on Saturday night, but by Monday morning, that world was a prison cell. "I have a secondary laptop," Chloe whispered, wiping her mascara-stained cheeks. "He didn't know about it. I kept backups of his private emails, the ones he sent from his burner phone to the offshore bankers. He told me to delete them, but I kept them, just in case." The prosecutor smiled grimly. "Just in case. Well, Ms. Hastings, it looks like just in case is today." Meanwhile, back at the Omnicorp headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from panic to a stunned, awed silence. At 11:45 a.m., the massive digital map on the trading floor, which had been flashing red for 2 days, suddenly blinked. Then, a wave of green swept across the screen. Thousands of shipping routes illuminated simultaneously. The servers were back online. The algorithm was functioning perfectly. Caroline walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking authoritatively against the hardwood floor. Thomas, the CFO, practically sprinted up to her, holding a tablet. They signed it. Thomas breathed, looking at the digitized signatures of the board members. You actually got them to sign it. 80%. They had no choice, Thomas, Caroline said calmly, walking toward the corner office, David's old office. Now get Amazon on the line. Tell them our temporary outage is resolved. And as a gesture of goodwill, we are waiving their routing fees for the next 30 days. It will cost us $1 million, but it secures the 10-year contract. And David? Thomas asked hesitantly. Caroline paused at the door of the massive glass office. She looked at the gold plaque that read, David Kensington, Chief Executive Officer. David chose his path on Saturday night, Caroline said, her voice betraying absolutely no emotion. Have maintenance remove that plaque, and tell HR to draft an immediate termination notice for Chloe Hastings. Let the FBI handle the rest. She walked into the office, the true and undisputed architect of the empire, finally taking her rightful seat at the throne. 7 months after the catastrophic gala at the Pierre Hotel, the biting wind of a New York January whipped around the concrete pillars of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse. The media circus camped outside was unprecedented for a white-collar trial. News vans lined Pearl Street, and reporters huddled in thick coats, clutching thermoses of coffee, waiting to catch a glimpse of the man the tabloids had brutally dubbed the defunded Romeo. David Kensington was no longer the golden boy of global logistics. As he stepped out of a modest black sedan, shielding his face from the flashing strobe of cameras, the physical toll of his spectacular fall from grace was glaringly obvious. His golden tan had faded to a sickly, institutional pallor. The bespoke Italian suits had been replaced by an ill-fitting, off-the-rack grey two-piece, a necessity given that the federal asset freeze had drained his offshore accounts and his high-powered defense attorney, Gregory Hayes, had dropped him for non-payment. Beside David walked Peter Gable, a perpetually sweating, mid-tier defense lawyer who looked entirely out of his depth. Inside courtroom 14B, the Honorable Judge Eleanor Davies presided with an iron gavel and absolutely zero patience for theatrics. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with financial journalists, law students, and a few disgruntled former investors from Omnicorp who had shown up just to watch David bleed. At the prosecution table sat Matthew Carmichael, the lead assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Carmichael was a shark in a cheap suit, known for dismantling arrogant executives with surgical precision. The government calls Chloe Hastings to the stand, Carmichael announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous, wood-panelled room. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Chloe emerged from the witness-holding room, looking nothing like the crimson-clad siren from the gala. She wore a conservative beige cardigan and a modest skirt. Her hair was pulled back into a severe ponytail, and she wore no makeup, highlighting the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the floor as she walked past the defense table, pointedly ignoring the venomous glare David was shooting at her. After she was sworn in, Carmichael approached the podium. "Miss Hastings," Carmichael began, his tone deceptively gentle. "Could you describe your relationship with the defendant, David Kensington, during your tenure as Director of Public Relations at Omnicorp?" "We were romantically involved," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "It started about 8 months before the 10-year anniversary gala. And during this romantic involvement, did Mr. Kensington offer to purchase a residence for you?" "Yes, a loft in Soho. He told me it was a company perk, executive housing to ensure I was close to the office for late-night crisis management." Carmichael pulled a document from his folder and displayed it on the courtroom monitors. "Let the record show this is Exhibit 42A, the deed to the Soho property, Ms. Hastings, whose name is on this deed?" "Mine," Chloe said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "But I didn't pay for it. David handled all the finances. He told me to just sign the papers." "He handled the finances," Carmichael repeated, nodding slowly. "Using funds routed through a shell corporation in Belize, named Apex Ventures." "Did you know about Apex Ventures, Ms. Hastings?" Chloe took a shaky breath. "I didn't know the name of the company at first, but a few weeks before the gala, David started using my secondary laptop at the apartment. He said Omnicorp's VPN was monitoring his main computer too closely because of his wife, Caroline. He was paranoid she was tracking his emails." David slammed his fist onto the defense table. "That's a lie," he hissed loudly. "Mr. Kensington," Judge Davies barked, her eyes flashing with warning. "One more outburst and I will have the bailiffs remove you from your own trial. Control your client, Mr. Gable." Peter Gable desperately yanked on David's sleeve, pulling him back into his chair. Carmichael didn't miss a beat. "You mentioned a secondary laptop, Ms. Hastings, the one you surrendered to the FBI. Can you tell the court what was on that laptop?" "Backups," Chloe sobbed quietly. "The laptop was synced to the cloud. Even after David deleted the emails from the local hard drive, they remained on the server. Emails where he explicitly instructed the offshore bankers to classify the $2 million wire transfer not as a real estate purchase, but as R&D software licensing to bypass Omnicorp's internal auditing. For the next 4 hours, Carmichael meticulously dragged Chloe through every damning email, every forged invoice, and every illicit text message. By the time Peter Gable stood up for cross-examination, the defense's case was entirely in tatters. Gable tried to paint Chloe as a gold digger who manipulated a naive CEO, but Chloe's tearful, immunized testimony held firm. She was a victim of her own greed, but David was undeniably the architect of the fraud. During the lunch recess, David cornered Gable in the holding room, his eyes wild with desperation. "She's killing us, Peter," David shouted, pacing like a caged animal. "You have to go after Caroline. Caroline is the one who set this all up. She built the algorithm. She knows how to manipulate the internal servers. She could have spoofed my IP address and planted those emails to frame me. She's a vindictive, jealous ex-wife." Gable rubbed his sweaty forehead. "David, that is a massive leap. We have no proof she spoofed anything. If we accuse the victim, who is currently the darling of Wall Street for saving the company, the jury will crucify you." "I don't care," David roared. "I am not going to federal prison because my wife couldn't handle being replaced. Put Caroline on the stand. Break her. Show the jury who she really is." Against his better judgment, when court resumed, Gable issued a hostile subpoena for Carolyn Kensington. The courtroom buzzed with electric anticipation as Caroline entered. She was a masterclass in composed intimidation, wearing a tailored navy blue suit, her posture flawless. She did not look at David once as she took the oath and sat in the witness box. Gable approached her, looking nervously at his notes. "Mrs. Kensington, isn't it true that you possess an advanced degree in computer science from MIT?" "It is," Caroline replied, her voice cool, clear, and perfectly modulated. "And isn't it true that you wrote the original Omnicorp routing algorithm? That you had unencumbered, administrative access to the company's central mainframe?" "I built the mainframe, Mr. Gable," Caroline said simply. "Of course I had access." Gable leaned in, thinking he smelled blood. "So you had the technical capability to log into the system remotely, to bypass security, to perhaps forge emails from your husband's account or route funds without his physical knowledge? Say if you discovered he was having an affair and wanted to destroy him." Matthew Carmichael stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is testifying and dealing in wild speculation." "I'll allow it, Mr. Carmichael," Judge Davies said, leaning forward, clearly intrigued. "But tread very carefully, Mr. Gable. Gable puffed out his chest. "I put it to you, Mrs. Kensington, that you orchestrated the transfer to Belize, that you planted the evidence on Ms. Hastings's laptop to execute a hostile takeover of the company and frame my client." The courtroom held its breath. David leaned forward, a triumphant sneer beginning to form on his lips. This was it. The trap was sprung. Caroline did not blink. She looked directly at Gable, and then, for the first time, shifted her gaze to David. The absolute void of emotion in her eyes made David's blood run cold. "Mr. Gable," Caroline said slowly, "I am an engineer. I do not rely on speculation. I rely on data." She turned her attention to the judge. "Your Honor, prior to the gala, when I first suspected financial irregularities, I implemented a silent, secondary security protocol on all executive devices to protect the company's intellectual property. It is a standard keystroke logger paired with a localized webcam trigger." Gable frowned, suddenly looking panicked. "A webcam trigger?" "Yes," Caroline continued calmly. "Whenever a wire transfer exceeding $500,000 is initiated from an executive laptop, the device silently records a 10-second video from the user-facing camera to verify biometric identity. It ensures that a stolen laptop cannot be used to drain corporate funds." She looked back at David. His face had gone completely, horrifyingly white. "I surrendered the encrypted server logs to the FBI 3 months ago," Caroline stated. "I believe Mr. Carmichael has them." Carmichael, looking incredibly smug, stood up. "We do, Your Honor. We were saving them for our rebuttal, but since the defense opened the door..." Carmichael tapped a few keys on his laptop. The large courtroom monitors flickered to life. The video was silent, grainy, and unmistakably damning. It showed David Kensington lying in bed in the Soho loft. Chloe Hastings was asleep next to him, her face partially buried in a pillow. David was holding the secondary laptop on his chest, illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. He looked directly into the camera lens, typed for a moment, and then pressed the enter key with a distinct, arrogant flourish. The timestamp in the corner perfectly matched the exact millisecond the $2 million was wired to the Belize shell company. The courtroom erupted. Reporters practically climbed over each other to sprint out the doors and file their breaking news alerts. The jury box looked at David with unified, unadulterated disgust. Gable stood frozen at the podium, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. He slowly packed up his legal pad, knowing his career had just evaporated alongside his client's freedom. David slumped back in his chair, his hands trembling. He stared at the frozen image of his own face on the monitor. He had demanded Caroline take the stand to prove she was a monster. Instead, she had methodically, publicly, and definitively buried him alive with his own arrogance. "No further questions," Gable squeaked, sitting down heavily. Caroline stood up, smoothed her skirt, and walked out of the courtroom, not looking back. She had a company to run. The sentencing of David Kensington took less than 20 minutes. Judge Eleanor Davies, citing his lack of remorse, his attempts to suborn perjury, and the staggering scale of the financial betrayal, handed down a sentence of 96 months, 8 years, in a federal penitentiary, followed by 5 years of supervised release. As the heavy steel cuffs clicked shut around David's wrists, he looked frantically toward the gallery, perhaps hoping for a sympathetic face. There was no one. His fair-weather friends had vanished, his board had abandoned him, and Chloe was long gone. Chloe Hastings avoided prison thanks to her cooperation agreement, receiving 3 years of probation and 1,000 hours of community service. However, the true punishment was the absolute destruction of her reputation. Blacklisted from every public relations firm and corporate entity in North America, the girl who once wore $4,000 dresses and drank vintage champagne on corporate yachts found herself living in a cramped, moldy studio apartment in Newark, New Jersey. She spent her days working as an assistant manager at a discount shoe store in a dying suburban mall, constantly looking over her shoulder, terrified that someone would recognize her from the endless true crimes podcasts detailing her downfall. Meanwhile, Omnicorp Logistics was dead. From its ashes rose Meridian Global, freed from the parasitic drain of David's reckless spending and ego-driven investments. Caroline Kensington transformed the company with terrifying efficiency. She was not a charismatic showman. She was a wartime general. She restructured the executive board, promoted Thomas to chief operating officer, and personally rewrote the routing algorithm to integrate cutting-edge machine learning, cutting global transit times by a staggering 14%. Within 18 months of the disastrous gala, Meridian Global was handling logistics for the Department of Defense, Amazon, and Walmart. The financial press, initially skeptical of the scorned wife narrative, quickly realized they were dealing with a generational tech visionary. Articles praising David Kensington were scrubbed from the internet, replaced by deep-dive profiles on Caroline's ruthless, brilliant operational strategy. On a crisp Tuesday morning in October, exactly 2 years after the night her marriage ended, Carolyn stood on the balcony overlooking the frantic trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. She wore a striking, tailored white suit, a stark contrast to the dark armor she had worn at the Pierre Hotel. Beside her stood Thomas, beaming with pride, and Sarah Jenkins, looking as sharp and dangerous as ever. As the digital clock ticked down to 9:30 a.m., Caroline grabbed the heavy wooden gavel. She didn't smile for the cameras. She looked down at the floor, thinking of the damp Chicago apartment where she had written the first lines of code while David slept. She thought of the years she had spent in the shadows, letting a lesser man claim her genius because she mistook his ambition for love. Never again. She slammed the gavel down. The opening bell rang out, a deafening, triumphant peal that echoed across the financial world. Meridian Global opened its initial public offering at $85 a share. By noon, it had skyrocketed to $130, cementing Caroline Kensington's status as the youngest self-made female multi-billionaire in American history. 300 miles away, in the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, the blaring horn signaled the end of the afternoon recreation period. David Kensington sat in his narrow cinder-block cell, wearing a faded khaki jumpsuit that bagged around his thinning frame. The arrogant spark in his eyes had been thoroughly extinguished, replaced by a dull, hollow stare. A corrections officer walked by the bars, tossing the day's mail onto David's thin mattress. David picked up the delivery. It was the latest issue of Forbes magazine, a subscription his mother paid for, the only luxury he had left. He flipped the magazine over to look at the cover, and his heart stopped. Staring back at him was Caroline. She looked magnificent, powerful, and utterly untouchable. The photograph captured her sitting at the head of the massive oak boardroom table, her hands folded, her gaze piercing right through the camera lens. The headline emblazoned across the cover read, "The Silent Architect Speaks, How Caroline Kensington Burned Down a Toxic Empire to Build a $10 billion Dynasty." David's hands began to shake. He opened the magazine to the feature article. His eyes scanned the text, desperately looking for his own name, hoping for some acknowledgement of his decade of work, some validation that he had mattered. He found his name exactly once, buried in the third paragraph. Meridian Global was born from the restructuring of Omnicorp, a predecessor company briefly managed by Kensington's ex-husband, whose financial mismanagement nearly bankrupted the firm before his federal indictment. That was it. Briefly managed. A suffocating wave of realization crashed over David in the cold, silent cell. He hadn't been a visionary. He hadn't been a king. He was just a loud, empty vessel that Caroline had propped up to handle the handshakes while she built the real world behind the scenes. And the moment he had forgotten his place, the moment he had foolishly tried to replace the architect with a decoration, she had simply pulled the plug, exposing him to the world as nothing more than a fraud. He let the magazine slip from his fingers, fluttering to the cold concrete floor. David Kensington pulled his knees to his chest, buried his face in his hands, and finally wept. In the end, David Kensington's spectacular collapse was not brought about by a sudden stroke of bad luck, but by the slow, poisonous accumulation of his own hubris. He made the fatal mistake of believing that the spotlight equated to power, entirely forgetting the quiet, brilliant force working in the shadows to keep his stage from crumbling. Caroline Kensington's revenge wasn't loud, violent, or chaotic. It was a masterclass in calculated precision, proving that true power doesn't need a microphone to command a room. It simply needs the leverage to lock the doors. She took back the narrative, the company, and her life, leaving the architect of her betrayal to rot in the ruins of his own ego. It's a chilling reminder. Never underestimate the person standing quietly in the background, because they just might hold the blueprints to your entire life.